Welcome to Content Disrupted, bold takes on brand marketing. I'm your host, Dan Baptiste, and together we'll explore what it takes to excel in brand marketing at one of the most exciting and disruptive times in industry history. Welcome to Content Disrupted. Today, we're thrilled to talk to the legendary David Aaker. David has one of the most impressive resumes in our industry, regularly referred to as the father of modern branding. That's a great title. David has published 18 different books, selling over 1 million copies on what brands need to do to win, researching what truly works and what doesn't. He developed the Aaker brand vision model, which many of you deploy today, and he's currently the vice chairman of profit and professor emeritus at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business. But why I'm most excited to talk to David is that he's built a decades-long career advising marketers on what to do, often 6 to 12 months ahead of major shifts in the market. Today, we find ourselves in a moment where we're all hungry for information and guidance on how to drive consensus around a clear path forward in what has become a fast-moving, volatile business environment further complicated by AI. I'll explore this topic with David today and hopefully get us all some answers. David, thanks so much for joining the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Awesome. So before we dig in, David, for those who may be unfamiliar with you, can you share how you got your start in marketing at MIT and how that propelled so much original thinking from you over the years?
Yeah, I've always been interested in marketing, and I had some great instructors at the Sloan School that got me into it. And then I went to work for Texas Instruments for a while and decided to get an MBA, and I drifted into a PhD, and then I went into a program at Stanford, and I ended up at Berkeley. And in my early years, I was a statistician. So it's kind of nice to be a statistician because I'm often sitting in a room where people assume you're not a statistician and they try to blow smoke.
Yeah.
But so I did a lot of work on econometric modeling. And then I drifted into advertising and then into brand strategic planning and marketing research. And then in the late 80s or 90s, there was a time in which brand equity sort of came to the fore. And one of the drivers was that the accepted business strategy of the day was to build market share. There was something called the BCG growth share matrix that drove that. There was empirical results that large companies made more money than small companies on the average. And that wasn't working. People weren't getting growth. They were, in fact, losing their brand and not achieving growth because they were buying share. And it turned out that the large companies had more than just a customer base to deal with. They had other things. So anyway, it didn't work if you're a small company to build share any way you wanted to. And then, curiously, digital started to arrive in the case of scanner data. And people found out they could manage marketing scientifically now with scanner data. And they were so pleased. Because now marketing could come out of the abstract area. And so they ran experiments, really good controlled experiments. And what they learned was the only thing that drove sales was price out promotions and other things like that. So everybody rushed into price out promotions and they destroyed brands. And they never got sales growth or at least permanent sales growth. They destroyed brands, destroyed margins. And that really also helped foster the arrival of brand equity. And so brand equity arrived, and that was at the right time in the right place. And I wrote a book defining brand equity and a second book on how you manage your brand to create brand equity. And I've sort of since then devoted my career to try to help people understand the role of brand equity and how they need to manage it.
I love that comment that you drifted into a PhD and floated into Stanford. I mean, it's such an impressive career, but I want to hop back because you mentioned something in this string here that is worth digging into. You talk about this fight and observation of brands chasing short-term gains and destroying that long-term value. Can you talk about the insights when you've kind of delved into that research? What was causing that deterioration of brand when they're chasing price and promotion? And how do you avoid that while still managing, the pressure that we have to generate short-term results?
That's really a good question. Well, I spent a time teaching and writing a book about business strategy. And it was in that context that I came to realize that short-term financials were playing a way too great a role in helping people chart their course. And it's a great question, what's causing it? And just as an aside, the brand equity came in as a remedy, because it taught people you have to build assets in order to have long-term growth, profitable growth, and a loyal customer base and so on. And so gradually people have adopted that. It really changed marketing dramatically. It changed who did marketing. That's now people, CMO and vice president of marketing, they're now at the executive suite. Before that, they were middle managers, basically outsourcing to agencies, brand building. And it changed, what the objectives were of the business, and then long-term assets came to be. But we get reminded even today that this sort of war is not over. And, Google just had a big layoff and they killed one of their social programs that was doing very well on an objective basis. And so it's not over. And especially when businesses get stressed, then the necessity to do bottom of the funnel stuff, to really create instant sales is enormous. And it's fundamentally driven by the stock value model and the fact that short-term profits spur your stock price. They generate stock value. And therefore, the careers of people that are responsible are on the line. And it's really hard to be patient. And fortunately, there's often not really a compromise, because if you have a really good long-term program, it'll probably work short-term as well. But that's not always the case. And even when it is, the temptation to overweight the short-term results is really huge.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've seen this at different points in your career, which you referenced. It's like business under stress, you retreat or you kind of turtle. And not unlike your reference with Google, that means cutting costs, abandoning long-term principles, chasing that short-term money, all in service of the business metrics and how they present up, right? But while that might get a short-term lift, have you seen through your research the long-term effect of that? Like, have you seen, I would imagine that isn't a path to growth, right? It's you're kind of shrinking your footprint in chasing what is low margin, highly competitive business at that point. Like, is there a measurable impact that you've observed in brands that have taken that path?
It's really hard to measure the impact. We have tried to do it econometric. I've had several studies in which with a friend, Bob Jacobson, we were able to demonstrate that if you look that on the average, if you change brand equity, you'll get a bump in stock return. And it'll be almost as much as the bump you get if an earnings announcement was behind it. So that's pretty impressive. And it's sort of reassuring to know in several databases, several time periods, that's consistently true, that a bump in brand equity will affect stock return. That really is of not that great a help to somebody inside an organization that's being pressured. So one of the ways to do it is with case studies. And so we can show case studies like, for example, the Dove Real Beauty program started about 17 years ago. And I mean, this is what was then bar soap. And they've since gone into shampoo and some other things. And they did it incidentally because their key driver, which is moisturizer, was kind of dead in the water. The patents had run out, competitors were doing it. And besides, who cares about moisturizer when you're selling shampoo or deodorant? So anyway, they needed something, and they stumbled upon this Real Beauty program to help women have more self-esteem and stop looking themselves through this artificial standard of beauty. And their sales went from 2.6 billion to 6.6 billion in that time period. It was driven exclusively by the Real Beauty program. I mean, it was not because they made better soap. And so there's a lot of examples like that you can show that really unambiguously show that building the brand gave it energy, gave it an image lift, gave it engagement, and of course, it did an enormous, hundreds of millions of women and girls have been changed by that program. And incidentally, when you have a program like that with so much commitment, with so much thought leadership, with so much impact, nobody accuses it of being superficial or selling or so forth. They know that there's real passion and authenticity behind it.
You're getting at kind of an interesting point here, which is the role of purpose in the brand, in branding, and how it kind of humanizes the brand to an extent. It makes it relatable, allows people to align to it. Is purpose an important ingredient when we're thinking about the role of brand and how to create brand equity? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. But just to add to my prior comments, another way to demonstrate the value of the brand is to actually measure your brand. And you do that by measuring the business, taking out the tangible assets, and trying to assess what role the brand has in the intangible asset thing. That's how everybody sort of measures a brand. And it's an exercise that kind of gets you thinking. Because the real value of a brand in your business is you have to think through your business strategy and say, what kind of brand strength do I need to enable this strategy? And that's really the fundamental question that gets you there. But with respect to purpose, there's an old story about in 1697 or something, this architect was walking down the street and he asked this guy, what are you doing? He said, I'm laying bricks. And you can see how each brick really fits in. And the next person, when asked, said, I'm building a wall. And look at the great wall. And the third person said, I'm building a cathedral. Well, people want to be building cathedrals these days. They don't want to be laying bricks. And that goes especially for employees, but also a good chunk of the customer base. And you don't need a huge chunk of the customer base to see the difference between profitability and struggling. So you need a purpose. And what I believe is that sometimes the purpose can cover social programs and social effort, but sometimes you need a social purpose and a business purpose. And because if you don't, you sort of distorting the vision and you're sort of forcing things, square things into round holes.
How do you navigate that, David, today when there's a fatigue around brands kind of venturing out into the social sphere where I totally agree with you, like having purpose? Is it a matter of tying the purpose to an area of relevance or something true within your DNA? Like, how do you not find yourself on the wrong side of like what is a weaponized political argument versus trying to make the world a better place?
Well, my take is that following Michael Porter's article in 2011, which he said businesses should benefit from social programs. They shouldn't be sort of a philanthropic arm that's separate. And so he wrote a really nice article, but he didn't mention that article branding. He talked about how companies could save money through energy reduction and how they could do other things, but he didn't ever mention a brand. And so my position is that he had the right insight that you really need a program that helps the business. But the way to do that is with a signature social program. And what people are doing now, they're really stepping up. It's really quite remarkable. It's really hard to find a business, small, medium, or large, that hasn't made a commitment to do some social good. But what they do, they have a grant program, they have a volunteer program, they have energy goals, and none of these really communicate much. What they communicate is an insane level of sameness because everybody's doing the same thing. There's nothing there that's newsworthy. There's nothing there that's different. There's nothing there that's inspiring. So what I'd say is that they have to put more of their effort into signature programs that really are visible, that really have a wow factor. They say, you got to see this. What these guys are really clever. They're really doing something worthwhile. And it needs to be branded, like the Dove Real Beauty program. And because when you do that, then you can create amazing energy lift for your business, an image lift, an engagement lift. And if you make as most people do, a product that's taken for granted, or it's boring, or it's even distasteful, like insurance, it's hard to get energy. It's hard to get an energy. It really is hard. And you can spend all the money you want, you won't get there. And yet, if you put in the right social program, like the Dove program, all of a sudden you get a huge amount of advertising or exposure and energy that you didn't pay for. And you got something that people are interested in. You got something that sort of yields stories that will turn the needle. And, Lifebuoy in India created a hand washing program, Help a Child Reach 5, because 2 million kids die before the age of 5 every year. And then they sort of re-energized an existing program, but they gave it a brand name. They gave it a much more professional program. And they put this in a couple of villages. They made videos of that, and those videos got 44 million views. I mean, Lifebuoy is a bar soap. They got 44 million views. And they did that it made an enormous difference to their market position and the energy, the image lift, and all that. And anyway, if you do that, then the brand manager is not sitting there like the guy at Google and say, well, what happens if we dump this food waste program? Nothing to our business. It's not going to affect it. It wasn't tied in. And it just made us feel good. And we had effective program. We had 11 people that were, matching their objectives. But if it helps up, nobody at Dove says that. Nobody at Dove says things are really bad. Maybe we should dump Real Beauty or cut it way back. That is their business program. Business strategy. And well, that's an extreme example. But then once the business strategy gets a benefit from the program, what's going to happen? Well, they're going to not only tap down the program, they're going to look for ways to make it thrive. They're going to give it better managers. They're going to give it more resources. And then it's going to, evolve further. It's going to thrive. And the business is going to be helped more. It's a flywheel. And so I think that's my view, that you really have to look at this differently. Not that it's easy, but it's got huge payoff for both the social effort and for the business.
As you're looking at this role of establishing like signature stories, you mentioned a couple of consumer brands and bar soap and Dove also soap. So it's kind of easy to picture how a consumer brand could play that role. Do you see a similar effort or ability for B2B brands or, folks in like high tech or others? Like, how do you see that brands in those spaces playing a similar role?
Well, curiously, I've spent a lot of time and effort trying to get people to use stories. And most people nod their head, yes, but then they don't do it. They don't do it because they don't have the people and facility, this talent to do it. They don't do it because they just don't get around to it. It's not a priority. And so, but mainly they don't do it because it's damn difficult to find them than to professionally put them out there. Now, the B2B companies are very different. B2B companies really get stories. And B2B, the consulting company I'm associated with, Profit, we have 150 stories. And most B2B companies do have as well. Because when they walk into a client's room, they want to know, well, what have you done that gives you credibility in this area? And so they grab this from this invariant story. They need 100 stories because they need one that'll closely match not only this guy's problem, but his or her or context. The people that sell sugar don't want to know any stories about flour manufacturers because they're not making flour, they're making sugar. And they're completely different. So anyway, they have all these stories and they're almost always shallow. They've taken all the tension out of it. They've taken all the interest out of it. They've taken all the tough days, the excitement, the way they overcome problems. That's all gone. It's just that this is what we did and the customer liked it. And so it's so watered down. To say it doesn't have a wow factor and it's usually down to, it has to fit on a page because that's a format or maybe a half a page. And so the problem in the B2B space is to get stories that are really impactful, that really resonate, that you really get to know the characters, that you understand the tension, you understand why you're really hoping for a result or fearing a result. And so that's a challenge for B2B companies. They have the stories, but they don't. Now you take, one kind of story that B2B companies often have is a founder story or the start story. You have the sales force sitting in that room with 4 or 5 people deciding they're going to have the 111 program. They're going to give 1% of their product, 1% of their employees' time, and 1% of their assets or profits to do social good. And that's a fabulous story because it indicates this is not something they just came up with because they were desperate for a strategy. This is something that was part of their DNA from the very beginning. And of course, now they've opened it up in response to their challenge. 10,000 companies have adopted that same program. And just think what those companies are, what they must think of Salesforce, because they've adopted their program. And out of these 10,000, there's a lot of companies that are their customers. And so, you have visibility with them, you have an image lift, you have a credibility lift, a trust lift. And they have a story to back it up.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And what you have is real connection. I mean, to your point earlier, like when you remove the tension, I'm not investing in that story. I don't believe it. I'm like, yeah, of course. You came in, you deployed your solution, they grew 10x, and it's all in one sheet and pretty and contained. Life doesn't work that way. So immediately people become skeptical. But when you start talking about how you did it and the role of different folks in overcoming unique challenges, if you're sitting on the other side of the table, you become invested because you see yourself in those characters, right?
And the beautiful part of social programs is that if we used to say in advertising, if you have nothing to say, sing it. Well, you could say, if you have nothing to say, create a social program that people really are interested in and has something to say. And, you look at the Lifebuoy program, for example, one of the 3 videos shows this woman this mother that's watering a tree and taking care of the tree. And you learn that next day that's would have been his son's 5-year birthday, but he died of an illness that could have been prevented if they would have had a hand washing program in place. And it's hard to watch that without crying. And it's so emotional. And you can talk all you want about statistics, 2 million die and we can do something about it. But the story is what grabs you. And incidentally, a story doesn't have to have the message inside it. It can be used to motivate the message. You tell the story about this woman and then you give them the statistics, or you give them the statistics first and you say, let me illustrate what that means by a story. And so it's sort of lend credibility or relevance to the statistics.
Yeah. And in a lot of ways, it diffuses what would be an argument, right? Like whenever you see statistics, then what's the first thing you're going to react to? Well, that's not true because X, Y, and Z, but you see a story and you're like, wow, that's powerful.
Yeah. And especially there's a famous story about Chevron, who was fighting a mass of bad publicity caused by a gas shortage. This is a long time ago, but anyway, they tried everything to say, we're not that bad. And we actually make 4%, not 40% on sales, and nothing worked. And then they had some cartoon dinosaurs that talked about how we're running out of oil and we got to conserve oil and we're part of the problem. Well, you don't argue with dinosaurs. I mean, you'd feel stupid by counter arguing against cartoon dinosaurs that are funny and folksy and the great music. And yeah, you don't think about counter arguing.
That's great. So I think another kind of principle that I've gained from you, which is interesting, is the difference between brand relevance and brand preference. And I think what we're talking about in kind of the lead up and even through some of these stories is how do you leapfrog out of what would be a competitive set and stand alone as almost like creating a category or a leadership position that's unique to the brand instead of saying this product is 10% faster or 5% cheaper. Can you talk about creating, the difference between brand relevance and brand preference in your mind, which we should be leaning more into and how we do that effectively?
Well, it started with an analysis I made of Japanese beer data. I looked at 30 years of data, and only 4 times did the market share trajectory change. And each one of them, you saw a new subcategory defined by what I call must-haves. And that explained all the variance over 30 years. And so I started looking at all kinds of product categories. And what I observed, there's with rare exceptions, you don't get any growth unless you have disruptive innovation that creates a new subcategory. You just don't. And there's all this, my brand is better than your brand, doesn't generate growth. And it's really astounding. And of course, a lot of people have known this for a long time. I think over the last 100 years of research and marketing, probably the most robust empirical finding we have in all of marketing studies is that we know what causes new brand or new products to succeed. It's how different they are. Because not only does being different give them a reason to buy the new product, it gives them a reason to listen to the advertising about it. Because if it's not new, they don't listen. So anyway, that's a cold, hard, empirical research fact. And so that sort of supports the premise that, you really have to change something in order to achieve growth. And so that means that you win not because my brand's better than your brand, you win because your brand's not relevant. And relevance means two things: awareness and credibility. That, everybody can know what that Toyota makes hybrids, but, they don't necessarily have a credibility in electric cars, electric vehicles. So everybody knows Toyota, they got high awareness, but with respect to this problem, namely buying an electric car, they don't have credibility because they don't think of them. When they think of electric cars, Toyota doesn't come up. And so you need to not only have awareness in general, you need to have it with respect to a certain context. And if that context is brand new, then you are going to lose because you're not relevant anymore. And so in brand equity, I defined it as being awareness, image, and I added brand loyalty, which wasn't commonly used at that time, but I've since changed awareness to relevance. Because just being awareness is not enough. You got to be aware in the context in which you're competing. And of course, the big winners are those that create the new context and own it, which is a brand.
Yeah, new context. Is it a matter of really picking? So for Toyota, I would argue there's not a lot of relevance within electric vehicles, but to your point, there's almost an ownership of hybrid. Like they are the leader in hybrid and they've kind of made a strong living in that arena. Whether or not that is relevant as much anymore, we can look at their numbers and decide that, right? But I think, as brands coming through, is it a matter of, instead of having this open-ended position within cloud computing or makeup, it's saying like, okay, how do we narrow it into a category or subcategory that we can truly own and go at it in a very focused way as a category leader or a subcategory leader? Do you find that level of focus is important in order to create the relevance that you describe?
Yeah, for sure. And incidentally, I don't think Toyota has the wrong strategy, incidentally. I think that Toyota has a different strategy than any other manufacturer by emphasizing the fact that climate change efforts have to be broad. They have to include gas cars, hybrid cars, and electric cars, and hydrogen cars. They're actually leaders in hydrogen. And I think that's a pretty it's pretty defensible strategy, especially because it's so different. And everybody else is the same, or they have been chasing electric vehicles instead of Toyota. So I wasn't at all implying that they're not doing the right strategy. But if somebody comes up with a new subcategory, like Prius came up with hybrid cars, they were not the pioneer. The early market leaders, rarely the pioneer. But anyway, they became the leader. And for 10 years, they virtually had no competition in hybrid cars. So if you're another manufacturer competing against Prius, you have, two choices. That you can become relevant and credible within their category, play their game. That's one strategy. Another strategy is you can try to leapfrog them and maybe create a variant of that subcategory that you will make Prius irrelevant. So anyway, maybe you put hybrids in trucks. Well, we're kind of past all that. But yeah, the point is, though, you have to be cognizant of subcategory competition as opposed to brand competition within an established, stable, permanent category.
So if I play that back within an established category, it's really difficult to leapfrog the competition because your choices are my brand or product is better or my brand or product is cheaper, which is a very difficult fight to win. Instead, saying, how do we position this, our company, our brand, our products in a new and different way that the customers care about, but isn't the same fight? Like, how do we not get in a bloody fight with competitive brands, but instead, how do we create a subcategory that's time relevant, it's interesting, it's true, it's valuable? Is that accurate?
Yeah. Well, take enterprise rent-a-car. There was a time in which all cars were rented at airports, and the business travel was by far the dominant thing. And enterprise rent-a-car went into the neighborhoods and said, if you have a car needs fixing, you want a vacation, you can rent a car from us. They must have gone 15 or 20 years with no competition, none. And until they passed Hertz. And then somebody said, hey, wait a second, maybe there's a business here. And yeah, so there's a case where they looked at a need that wasn't being met. And because what people tended to do in those days, and a lot of times they look, who's the big user? I want to go after the big user because that's where the money is. And so anyway, yeah, and there's a lot of people. Tesla really was the pioneer in electric vehicles. They weren't the first ones, but they're the first ones to get it right. And they own that for 10 years. And of course, that's just a subcategory of the automobile business.
So as we're looking at kind of creating that category or subcategory, thinking about signature stories that allow us to play big and drive alignment and kind of tie it together, now it comes to message distribution, right? So if we think of, to your point a minute ago, like who are the big audiences? Well, today it's how do I personalize this message? And now I have so many different channels and so many different audiences and all of the complexity that didn't exist previously when I could run an ad or have a mass message. That it seems like the world has gotten more complex. So to that point, how do you think about adapting, or do you think about adapting signature stories for different components of your audience or different portions of your audience? And then separately, how do you think about bringing these stories to market at scale when you have all of these different, website, digital, social, physical channels? Like, how do you navigate that as a marketer?
Well, what you're really looking for is stories that go viral. And that there's a lot of luck in that. But if you get a story that really, really clicks, you at least have a chance. And of course, back to the B&B case where you have hundreds of stories that are all watered down, how do you generate, what you really like is to generate 6, really juicy stories for 6 applications that will cover most of the needs. So when a representative is talking about your product, you can pull one of those and it may not fit 100%, but at least it'll really attract attention. And then maybe 1 or 2 stories that tells the story of your whole organization. And so that's what I encourage B2B companies to do, that out of this 150 stories or 300 stories or whatever you have, let's pick out some that we can really depth, really that will resonate, that will have some emotion, that'll have some tension, that will, really have a chance to be shareable.
Do you think, absent of a single piece of content going viral, like could you create momentum differently? So as we think about, what we refer to as like atomizing stories, like how do you take the essence of a story and pull it into social posts and emails and personalized versions and start bringing that story out to the world differently than in years past, so it has a greater chance of getting lift and equity versus, what you refer to as a lower probability viral story? Like, are you bought into that conceptually, how to take and adapt a message for channels and audiences to drive that out?
Well, yeah, some stories get so familiar that you can't really tell them anymore. But what I actually have argued to some of the political specialists, they really need to use taglines and visual symbols better. But it certainly applies to stories. A story that's so established can have a visual symbol or a tagline. There was one of the great stories is there was a appliance manufacturer in China in 1987 that was going under. I mean, it was going to fail. And they took a middle manager, made him CEO, and said, see if you can save this sucker. And 2 weeks later, a customer came in with a defective appliance, and he went to the warehouse and found 30% of them were defective. He took those onto the shop floor, and he got a sledgehammer, and he had his employees smash them. And he said, from now on, we're building quality products. No more defects are going to be in our inventory. And that company is renamed Haier. They're now the largest appliance manufacturer in the world. And that story is part of their success. And that sledgehammer is now in a museum in their home office in China. And that's, present that sledgehammer here and there. They don't have to retell a story. They just put the sledgehammer out and everybody gets it. And, all the employees know exactly. They don't have to say, quality is really important to us and we're looking at the quality measures and so on. They just put out a picture of the sledgehammer. And it's so powerful. And so I'm trying to get some of the political specialists to understand that.
Yeah. As we think about marketing leadership and organizations and coaching people toward the future, there is a lot of uncertainty. People are confused, unsure on the role of AI and, what does that mean for staffing and team collaboration? Can it do our job for us? Can I do this with far less people? Have you explored the shift in organizational structure and staffing needs and the role of strategy from human beings that can't be replicated from a machine? And what are some of the areas that you see that marketers aren't prepared for or are using old methods in a way that may slow them down as we look at the future?
Well, I think one of the big uses of AMI would be to create disruptive innovation in the marketplace. And I think that's going to happen when AI finds a home in little niche markets, some subset of medicine, some subset of air travel or something. And so then that becomes a vehicle to create some must-haves that didn't exist before. So I think that AI in general is not going to be as important as AI tailored to various applications as far as creating new offerings go. But as far as using AI, I mean, our organization, as most of them, do a lot of things more efficiently now than we did before, because things like pulling together facts and organizing opinions and data can be done much more quickly. And it doesn't mean that they do 100% of the job, but maybe they do 70% of the job. And so organizations like ours are sort of struggling to make sure that we are as on top of it as anybody is.
So as we think about this next wave of marketing and where you see the world headed, one, we want to be aware of history so we don't repeat the past and, all of the issues with, brand damaging and chasing short-term returns or value, or even, the role of brand in question versus just the business is just here as a cash register, right? So when you look at some of the determining factors for, let's say, 2025, where do you see brands stepping out to win? And where would you see brands failing based on either operating in ways that are unproductive or not evolving fast enough?
Well, I feel I have some kind of a bias in this, but I objectively think that the future of branding resides in these three areas. I think at the top of the list is learning to use branding to make disruptive innovation successful. And a brand has to become the exemplar of the category. They have to position the subcategory. They have to grow it to create a healthy installed base that'll be a barrier to others. And they have to create barriers in other ways, create branded features and maybe create dynamics in the subcategory, adding new features or improving old ones. So that's all a branding job. So I think people have to understand now that disruptive innovation is happening much more frequently with much more impact. Branding has got to be such an important part of that. And if all these books and articles on disruptive innovation never even mentioned branding, most of them were, yeah, it's really amazing. So anyway, I think that's a real opportunity. And the second one is we have a long way to go, is to understand how social programs should help a business by giving energy and image lift and engagement to their brand. And I mean, I think there's so much on the table there because there's so much effort going into a social program that's not effective and is not helping the business, and therefore is not receiving long-term attention. And then finally, more tactically, people have to use stories in order to break through the media clutter, the information overload, the skepticism that audiences have.
Fantastic. And David, as we wrap, or I know you've written more than 18 books. Are there any in particular, as you think about kind of reminding marketers about what's most important that you think would resonate today in today's climate?
Well, I just think the last two are the ones that I'm most focusing on. So the disruptive innovation and the social programs. But I wrote a book. One of my early branding books was called Brand Portfolio Strategy. And I think to this day, it's the only book on that topic. And that's really important to understand that your brand portfolio, I mean, nobody has a brand. Everybody is involved with a team of brands and team that's working with other brand teams within your organization. And you've got to manage that so there's clarity, so there's synergy, so there's leverage, so there's relevance. And I think that is still a really tough problem. When people come to us with a brand portfolio problem, it's not like a brand positioning problem where you kind of can turn the crank. You know what works, that out at the end will come a brand position. Brand portfolio is not that way because it's so idiosyncratic, so dependent on the business strategy, so related. It enables, it's driven by, and it involves sub-brands. It involves branded differentiators, branded energizers, endorsed brands. And it's really important to get that right. And it's dynamic.
Awesome. So in summary, as we think about the path forward, really thinking about the why and why do we matter and how do we amplify that with signature stories and demonstrate that through storytelling and start cascading those stories across different channels, and really thinking about the principles that you laid out here when it comes to effective brand building, right? Like have purpose behind what you do. You're not going to win in a high growth market in the trenches, right? It's not I'm better than you, I'm cheaper than you. It's I'm different than you. And how do you communicate that through effective storytelling at the right level of scale? David, thank you. Really appreciate the insights you provided, not only today, but throughout your career. I think you've been a great asset to the marketing community, and we're thrilled to have you today. So thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Thank you for listening to Content Disrupted, brought to you by Skyward. To stay up to date on the latest ideas and insights in brand building and content marketing, visit our website at skyward.com. That's skyword.com. Join us for our next episode, where we'll continue to challenge marketing norms and inspire you with fresh strategies for growing business through brand storytelling.